Friends, we are a group of contemplative outreach members and then also many people that embrace the 12-step spiritual program. And these two worlds are coming together for this conference, which is awesome. Some of us have envisioned that for many years and just moved forward with it. So, welcome. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I love to throw that in at parish meetings, and people that are not in 12-step are always a little taken aback, but then they join in because they've heard that prayer before, they've just never prayed it. So now you've prayed the serenity prayer with us. I was asked to just share a few anecdotes about Father Keating and my life in the monastery. I lived there for 2 years as a monk, and I've been visiting there for over 30. First went in 1989. And this is just as a matter of our love and admiration for Thomas, to share a few quick stories. Thomas, you know, these are a bunch of men living together, and they tease each other a lot. They all love each other. Not all of them are contemplative. Some of them are just shy and introverts. Some of them, quite frankly, don't understand what Thomas is teaching, not the way you do. But they all love each other. They love Thomas because he was one of the senior members, an abbot. They all had tremendous respect on that level for him. But Thomas teased me a lot about my weight, because it's always been a battle. Never in a way that felt abusive, because I always felt loved by Thomas. But Thomas, as many of you know, was razor thin all his life and very tall. But the last 10 years or so before he really slowed down, he was a big man, and he wore that blue sweater for, I think, about 50 years. And he would come into the kitchen and watch me cook and ask me questions, and we'd be yakking. And sometimes I would go up and lift that sweater, and I'd say, "What's going on here, Thomas?" Because he was getting quite a punch. And he'd say, "Isn't it dreadful?" So I got to get him back a little bit. And then I want to tell you quickly, one time I fell apart with Thomas in 30 years. I was living as a monk, and Joseph said, "Matt, you're hitting it too hard," but I was meditating a few hours a day and living a life of silence and solitude. And then I sat a 10-day on top of it, and I just came undone. It was glorious. I literally had, just tremendous unloading. Thomas was away, and he came back, and we got together for our weekly meeting. And the one time in all those years that I just fell apart, I was just sobbing. And he said, "Oh, you poor little lamb." And he handed me a box of Kleenex that probably had been sitting there 15 years. I told him that I had so much anger, so much grief pouring out of me, grief and anger and grief pouring out of me. I don't think I can take it anymore. And I stopped long enough to blow my nose, and he said, "Next comes dread." So he was such a comfort. But anyway, for the record, I did a talk yesterday, and I spoke with Irish Matt today. I'm going to give him 3 handouts that he's going to attach to the videos or whatever. One is all those wisdom quotes. The second is the map of reality that I love to putz with. And then today, I had written down over the years some centering prayer and 12-step parallels that I thought were very obvious. I was a young man, 29, when I was introduced to centering prayers in 11th step brand new in recovery. So from the very start, the two worlds were together. I wasn't old enough, nor did I have a vision for how they could come together. I didn't know how to do that, but I knew that they should. And you know, Gail Fitzpatrick spoke about how it's usually one person that starts something. The spirit starts to move. That's always been my observation. And in the same way I shared yesterday that I see ourselves as tiny drops of grace, and we open and this ocean of grace begins to fill us, and it starts to overflow and bless others. And so in that sense, Tom Skinner and Don Master, and now if these men were still living, I would say Tom S. and Don M., because anonymity is such a sacred tradition in 12-step. But they have both moved on, and they are saints now. I knew Tom Skinner, but only on the peripheral. I think I served him on a retreat one time, and we sat and had a talk, and I read his book, which is awesome. But that was happening in the Northeast, and that was a little vein going on. And at the same time, or perhaps a few years before, and I'm telling you all this because I think it's important for the archives, Don Masters was a fella in Colorado. And I don't know how I met Don, I don't remember. But he knew that Brother Matthew was in 12-step. And Don Masters had the vision that Thomas Keating had to turn his attention to 12-step. Don was adamant. Thomas would say to me, because he knew I was in 12-step and he knew that Don had this desire, this went on for a few months, he would say to me, Matthew, warn me if you see him. He's hounding me. I think Thomas thought that he was too busy. He knew nothing about 12-step. Why on earth do you want, Thomas didn't, he often said, well, why would you ask me? I don't know anything. He wasn't filled with ego, that's for sure. So anyway, this is my recollection, and it's firsthand. I think it's accurate. Somehow, Don managed to get the book, The Soul of Sponsorship, into the hands of Father Thomas Keating. This is a book that details decades of letters between Bill Wilson, one of the founders of AA, and his spiritual director, a Jesuit in St. Louis, Patrick Dowling. And they wrote each other for years. Thomas was getting on a plane to go to Asia, and Don somehow got that book in his hand. When Thomas came back, we had our weekly meeting, and he referred to, first of all, I couldn't believe he knew who Bill Wilson was, and he referred to him as the poor little lamb. And he said, Matthew, if he had an 11th step practice, and I thought, did Thomas Keating just say 11th step practice? He said, if that poor little lamb had had a regular 11th step practice, he could have avoided years of suffering. Because for those of you who know, Bill was a wounded man. And personally, I think if you don't have an 11th step practice, you're never going to get in touch with the unconscious wounds. And so thus began what Thomas turned to, which was he was willing to put his attention to it. And then Don and his friend Marty invited me to help them do a 5-day retreat at the monastery. And as far as I know, it was the first 11-step retreat featuring centering prayer. And shortly thereafter, I invited Don and Marty to come to St. Louis to present it. And then I went back to the monastery because the you-know-what hit the fan. A lot of people in 12-step were very resistant to it. And Jim M. and Joelle M. and Joanne S. had the stamina and the perseverance to dismantle all that resistance, to work with Father Thomas, taking some of the religion out of the brochures, and eventually it evolved, and I played a very small part. It was an instance of happenstance, but most of all, it was the love bubbles that had anointed me, and I was moved to share them with others. I go into the prisons. As a priest, I hear a lot of fifth steps and a lot of confessions in prisons. And recently, an African-American man who I think was about 45 or 50, and I'm telling you verbatim what he told me. He met his biological father one time in prison. They crossed paths. And he told him what he thought of him, and it was ugly and dreadful. He told him he was a piece of something and to rot in hell, basically. I'm summing up. 20 years later, in another prison, his son told him the exact same thing, that he had never met. He knew about this boy, but he had never met him. I don't think I've ever seen a grown man more broken. All I could do was suffer with him. And I assured him I would pray for him. But I thought about it a lot, and I thought, you know, he was seeing as the child of a man from one perspective, and now he's the father, and probably seeing from another, and yet that compulsion to repeat just played out almost. He said to me, Father Matt, my son, it's like he read the script I read 20 years ago. So how do we stop the cycle? And surely only healing, and healing of the unconscious. And I just have a feeling that everyone can relate to this stuff, whether you are an addict or not.
Thomas's concept of the divine DNA, it's one of the things that I want to just say thank you to all you who are parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, because I truly believe you are changing the DNA structure going forward when you really consent to your healing. And just a quick mention of Tom Skinner. You know, Tom Skinner's spiritual advisor was Mary Mrzowski. And when Mary died, he asked Thomas if he would pick up that role. And so I just love how the threads continue to weave. Thank you.
Matt, I didn't know you were on that 2003 retreat. I just happened to go there because somebody else couldn't go, and they say, hey, why don't you go? We have a 12-step centering prayer group, and maybe they're doing what we're doing in Phoenix. And it was funny, my impression of that was that it was a very new thing. People were just like thinking, yeah, this would be a great addition. But it kind of took a turn where they were, some people there were talking about it. Well, I tried the 12 steps and I didn't really get everything I could out of it, but now centering prayer is the answer. And I think it just took a while before the two really merged and really, had that synergistic kind of feeling. And so whenever we go out and talk to people in 12-step recovery, we make it very clear that the 12 steps give us everything we need, and centering prayer enhances the 11-step practice of it. There's no deficiencies that we're missing in the 12 steps, and we really, make such a big deal out of that.
We did that first retreat at Snowmass at St. Benedict's. Thomas read this book and was ready to look at this stuff. And Don and Marty said, let's do a retreat. They had a binder this thick. It was enough for 16 retreats. But we had to have a group conscience to allow Thomas to come to some of the meetings. And he had never been at a meeting. He was fascinated by them. And at that retreat, there were doctors who ran recovery centers and people out of 3 weeks of treatment and everything in between. And one woman in particular did not realize she wasn't Catholic and had not been exposed to any kind of Catholic or monastic culture. She got a kick out of Thomas and was very intrigued. But when she realized he was a priest, she turned on him. And it was sort of the height of a lot of headlines. And she was really something and said some awful things to him. And Thomas would, talk about the welcoming prayer. He would listen to her. Thomas would never let anyone abuse him. Thomas, as far as I'm concerned, said exactly what he thought, but always with love. And so he would take what she gave him and transform it into love and give it back to her. By the end of the week, she was so confused she couldn't talk. But anyone else?
A lot in my head. Your story, Father Matt, made me think about generational trauma. And in the 12-step community and in the contemplative community, we don't always use that word trauma. But with the younger contemplatives and in my BIPOC spaces, both in contemplative and recovery spaces, we talk about trauma a lot. And I've wondered what Father Thomas would have to say about trauma-informed psychology, which wasn't a part of the conversation, the psychological conversation of his time so much. But I don't know what my question is, but it seems like it's becoming increasingly important to use the language of trauma and trauma's relationship to sin or the human condition. And anyway, that's what I wanted to bring. I don't know what the question is.
It's a profound reflection. I meant to say this yesterday, but you say 5 things you didn't mean to say and 3 that you wished you had. Some of you will say, well, Thomas Keating's legacy will be he taught centering prayer. I don't think that will be it. I think Thomas Keating is a saint. I don't think it, I know it. Now, whether or not he'll be a saint someday, I don't know. But I think Thomas Keating's great contribution to the curriculum is he was utterly authentic, he was very intelligent, and he lived the contemplative life for 70 years. He was the real deal. And he explained the entire Christian contemplative tradition. John of the Cross spoke of dark nights. Avila speaks of mansions and secret rooms. Keating speaks of the entire paradigm in the language of modern psychology. I think that will be his most important contribution. Who doesn't relate in the world today to the idea of conscious and unconscious, of evolving consciousness, of evolutionary consciousness? So others may not agree with that, but I think that will be Father Thomas Keating's greatest legacy. And it's a whole new way to understand and articulate and write theologies on sin, the theology of original sin, which is a beautiful theology, but which was so corrupted and presented in such dreadful ways. And now it can be presented in a way that is so healing. And I always point to poor Pat, because she knew Thomas as well as anyone. Thomas Keating knew a thing or two about childhood trauma.
It's bringing back so many memories. You know, Don Masters did just a regular 10-day intensive, and he was just absolutely passionate on several walks and talks about meeting Thomas and how this fit in with 12-step and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, that meeting that I set up with him and Thomas led to, there were at least 2 retreats before that 5-day. And so the first one was like 3 days, Friday to Sunday. And he and Marty handpicked the people who attended those first 2 retreats, just as Thomas handpicked the 12 people that attended Lama 1 and Lama 2. It's like this brilliance of these masters of who they're going to send out to the world to, as you said this morning, your recognition of taking it back out to go not only bubbles, but waves into the global planet. And the progression just blew my mind, because the very first retreat for 3 days, absolutely no one went down to Mass, 0. And the carloads of snacks that came into the kitchen were horrendous. You know, that monastery or that retreat house kitchen had never seen so much friggin' sugar. I mean, it was like, ugh. And I couldn't keep the coffee pot. I could not keep that damn coffee pot full, you know. So then the second retreat, they added a day to it, and maybe 3-4 people went down to Mass. But by the time it increased to the 5 days and then to a 10-day intensives that the AA people took over, everyone was going to Mass. Everyone was going to Mass because Thomas was coming up twice a day and feeding them different food from what I was feeding them. I was interested in that question about trauma too, because before I served that first 3-day one, I freaked out. I literally freaked out. I was awake all night long because Dawn had filled me in on some of these people that they handpicked. And like I knew that one of these kids had been a cocaine user and, you know, was in recovery, blah, 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 blah. And I had no AA experience. So my head, with the experience of serving 10-day intensives, was, good Lord, you know, if these people start unloading the unconscious, am I going to be able to handle this? And I mean, I literally freaked out and called Thomas in the morning, and I said, I'm freaking out. And he said, oh, Pat, you're not serving the retreat. The Holy Spirit is serving the retreat.
My name's Jim Davis. I go by Hound Dog. I did the 12-step in Folsom Prison. I was a lifer, did 34 years. I met Thomas Keating when he came to Folsom Prison. And to me, it was like meeting Dr. Billy Graham for the first time. Now, I went to Board of Prison Terms, and me being a lifer, you got to know those steps backwards and forwards. And then when I finally got to myself, like step 1, I admitted I was powerless over my drugs and alcohol, that my life became unmanageable. 2, came to believe that power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. 3, made a decision to turn my will and life over to the care of God as I understood Him. And 4, made a search and fearless moral inventory of myself. Then I went to step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. I tried to carry the message to the alcoholic addict on the yard. Now, going to talk to Father Keating at Folsom, he accepted me for me. He didn't judge me as a lifer. He didn't judge me for doing all that time in Folsom. He came to me at love, which a lot of us, we didn't get that. We got broken or whatever happened in our situation that brought us to Folsom. And he was a caring guy. It was trippy looking at him because he reminded me of Moses. He had this big old robe on. He had a leather belt. And he was talking to us like I'm talking to you, out of love. And in prison, you're not supposed to give nobody hugs, because it's called over-familiar with staff. I gave them a hug, and they didn't thrash me. I was real surprised that they didn't, put me in a hole over that. But it was a big thing for us. And there's guys, you got 2 prisons in Folsom. You got Old Folsom, it was built in the 1800s, and then you got New Folsom, was built in 1985. And there's cops coming from New Folsom just to go over to see Father Keating. And then when I went to the Board of Prison Terms, they asked you, how do you know all these important people? It says in Luke 2:52, favoring God, man. God, I used to write letters to Father Keating in Snow Mass. I had personal letters. And they said, how do you know these people? And God gave me favor with Jackie Spears and Senator Gloria Merrill. I was trying to sell my hobby in there to pay my restitution off. And they're all looking at me all puzzled like, how do you know all these people? Only God made that possible. And that's the only reason you can make that possible. I was born and raised Catholic. My mom was a Catholic till the day she died. And it's kind of crazy how God works things out. And I used to call her on the weekends. Not one of them ever seen me in prison, not one. But the Lord told me to call her on a Wednesday. And I thought, this is kind of strange. I said, Mom, the Lord told me to call you on a Wednesday. And she said, the Lord says, tell her what it's like to die. Now, in my younger days, I was learning to be a rodeo clown. I got smashed by a bull and had a near-death experience. I got to see heaven, and not everybody comes back. I came back. He says, it's not your time, come back. And I thought that was kind of strange. Well, I said, hey, Mom, the Lord told me to tell you what it's like to die. And she got real quiet. I said, Mom, it's like someone socking your stomach, knocking the wind out of you, and turn on the light. You're in the presence that quick. And she got real quiet again. And then he said, make amends with her. I didn't know what the word amends was. And I don't sound like I'm dumbing her box of rocks, but I didn't know what the word amends. And God says, tell her you're sorry for whatever you did to her. And I said, Mom, I'm sorry for whatever I did to you. He says, tell her everything you loved about her. Now, I told her, I thank you for being when I first Holy Communion confirmation. I was an altar boy, and I was always in those special ed classes, but trying to learn Latin was like, man, it was like I couldn't do it. But the priest said you'll go to hell if you don't learn, and man, I was trying to learn the best way. I figured, man, I'm going to hell for sure. But the thing of it is I had a learning experience, and then like Father Keating says, when you get that situation, give it back to God. Your center in prayer, you give it back to your center in prayer. My God, who I choose called Jesus Christ, He got me clean and sober. I got a chip on my phone, 38 years clean and sober since 1986. I can only do that through God, who I choose called Jesus Christ. And they get mad at me when I go to those AA and NA meetings. But he says, you can't bring that in here. I says, I'm bringing it because this is my story. And they get all sucked up and they'll get over it. But the thing is, Jesus is my Lord and Savior. And if He can bring people like Father Keating and other professional folks in there in prison where a lot of guys never get no visits. And after my wife died, I was married to her 15 years. She died in 2002. And man, I got broken. Man, I lost the will to live. But God says, hey, I made a covenant with God in 1999. He says, God didn't even bring an angel. He says, God didn't make that covenant with you. You made that covenant with God. And I'm thinking, how's He know? And I figured out He was an angel because we entertain angels don't know it.
My friend, thank you so much
All right.
for all of that. And you know what? When you say the sacred word, I believe you're doing the first 3 steps every time you say that word. Can I just say very briefly, too, that I know Joelle and Terry and those of you on the 12-step team, raise your hands. Would you mind? And, you know, these folks are a resource to you. There are meeting formats that have really evolved. They're very carefully put together and chosen. I don't want to ever suggest that religion has not wounded people, because it has. There's a lot of people that say they're recovering Catholics. So it has wounded people. But on the other hand, the big book and the 12 and 12 make crystal clear that 12-step programs can seek additional input, our teachings from traditions about this matter of prayer and meditation. We are not talking about dogmatic or doctrinal aspects of religion, which often divide us. But it's okay to have a simple method being taught if people are interested. So I have evolved in that I shared the first night, there are first step meetings, there are 4th step meetings, there's 6th and 7th step meetings. 11th step meetings are perfectly wonderful. And you have 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes of silence, whatever people can handle. And there's absolutely no reason not to have 11th step meetings in your community.